like you think, then you think. And this is where they gather. Danielle Smith on 770 CHQR.
Brought to you by the Popowich Carmeli Advisory Group, CIBC Wood Gundy.
All right, guys. As you know, I pride ourselves on this show of being able to talk about controversial and difficult topics and be able to have a broad range of perspectives that can be aired, and we can still end our conversation as friends. So just in that spirit, I hope that you'll keep an open mind as you hear from my next guest. If you want to watch this online, you can, because we're on Facebook Live, right, Adam? Yeah, so we're on Facebook Live if you want to go on and watch my guest, Caylan Ford, former United Conservative Party candidate in Calgary, Mountain View. She's got a story to tell about what happened here, and I thought you'd want to hear it directly from her. So let's get right to it. Caylan, thanks so much for being here.
Well, I really appreciate your having me on.
Well, I don't know if you're going to after all this is done, because I'm very torn.
It's a roll of the dice.
Well,
man.
I'm torn about whether this is a good idea for you to talk about this now, or if you should have waited until after the campaign, or if you should have waited until there was a period of time where people were less impassioned and able to talk about it rationally. Why did you decide you want to talk about it now?
Well, I guess some context is in order here, right? So up until just about 2 weeks ago, I was the United Conservative Party candidate in Calgary, Mountain View. And I decided to step back from the race the night before the election was called, because I received an email that evening from Press Progress, which is effectively it's an organ of the NDP for all intents and purposes, right? It sort of
We've had Duncan Kinney on here before, so people know exactly what perspective they come from.
Yeah, so I mean, it purports to be a news organization, but I've been the subject of very misleading articles in Press Progress before. I kind of understood that I was not going to get a fair hearing with them, and that they're not really interested in seeking truth or treating their subjects fairly. So they sent me an email and said, we have excerpts of private conversations that you had years ago on topics related to immigration and terrorism. And we're going to be running this story in 2 hours. Do you want to comment? And the story that they intended to run was going to try to, in my view, sort of cynically misappropriate the recent terrorist attacks in New Zealand, and to try to conflate me with white supremacy or with terrorists. I think that you have to either be like an illiterate person or someone who's engaging in a really bad faith form of motivated reasoning to attribute to me the views that they attributed to me. Basically, I said, in my view, in no uncertain terms, that I think white supremacy is odious, that it's a system of reasoning that is perverse, and somehow they interpreted that as an endorsement of white supremacy. So I decided to step back from the race because, I mean, you know how election cycles work. There's not a lot of time. People don't give you a fair hearing, right? You're not going to be able to go on a show and have a sort of extended academic conversation about what were you talking about, what is the context, what was edited out that would have potentially been sort of exculpating information, right? No one is going to want to hear that from you. Right? So I just sort of thought, I don't want this to dominate the news cycle for the next, 3, 4, 5, 10 days. I don't want to be a distraction to the campaign. And also, there's something here that I think I need to fight and need to confront. And I don't know that I would be able to do that if I was still simultaneously trying to run as a candidate.
We could get into some of the quotes that were made, and maybe we will as we go along, but I think people need to understand the person who, because it was a private conversation. Obviously, there's probably a limited number of private conversations that you would have about these issues. So you've named him. I won't give his full name because you've mentioned that there's another high-profile person in Calgary who shares the same name.
That's right. Yeah.
But let's refer to him as his first name, Karim. And he is he was described, I think, in the story as a prominent Muslim conservative in conservative circles. And so I think people will, the thing that is I guess what a lot of people are wondering is, if you were having these kinds of conversations, why would you have these kinds of conversations with somebody who was only an acquaintance? I mean, how did you get drawn into this kind of discussion? What can you tell us about your history with Karim?
So the background, I lived in, for about a little more than 2 years, I lived in Toronto. He was from Toronto. We met early 2017 at an Ontario PC party event. And Started chatting. He friended me on Facebook, sent me an article by Stephen Harper on ordered liberty, and we just struck up a conversation. It's not every day that you find people in political circles who share your intellectual interests and really sort of enjoy talking about ideas in that way. And so pretty quickly we got drawn into, we would have pretty regular conversations on a huge range of philosophical and social and political topics. And his favorite topic was immigration. He lived in France. He attended the Sorbonne. He was very disturbed at what he saw as the sort of decline of French culture, which he credited to a failure to assimilate immigrants to France. And so his favorite authors are people like, this probably won't mean anything to most listeners, but people like Pascal Bruckner and Houellebecq, who wrote the book Soumission. He would encourage me to read these authors. Douglas Murray's Strange Death of Europe.
People may have heard of Douglas Murray, but that came from Karim. Those are the
this is him. I mean, so there is I think anyone who knows him and knows his politics finds Press Progress's characterization of him to be sort of ludicrous.
You describe him as somebody who believes that immigrants should completely cast off ties to their ancestral homelands, including their religion, language, dress, and cuisine, and assimilate fully into the host culture. Those are things that he relayed to you.
Yes. So that was his solution to the challenges that immigration on a large scale can present, is he basically proposed multiracial but monocultural civic nationalism. And he's on, there's a public record of him talking about these ideas. So in his words, immigrants should leave their cultural baggage at the airport, is what he once wrote. And so a lot of our debates were about testing the limits and the applicability of these theories. These are difficult conversations. They're conversations that engender a lot of questions that are uncomfortable, and for which, in many cases, I don't have definitive answers or even fixed opinions, right? But the benefit of a private kind of academic conversation is that it is, at least in theory, it's a safe environment to test ideas, to sort of identify gaps in your own reasoning or the other person's. And I always assumed, and I think, trust, good faith are a precondition to being able to do that and to sort of act as a check against your own biases or your own blind spots. Can I get you to counter this too? Because I think it's important to know where he was coming from in your conversations, but it's equally important to know where you were coming from in your conversations, because you're being tied to this white nationalist viewpoint. Yeah. And yet you have great appreciation for Asian culture and Asian society. You're fluent in Mandarin. Can you give a bit of your history about where you were coming from in these discussions? Yeah, I'm not fluent in Mandarin, but I've spent like 10, 15 years sort of learning and forgetting and relearning Mandarin. It's a difficult language, but it's like, so for anyone who actually knows me and knows my history and my resume, I think I had a friend reach out and just said, there is just a certain insane preposterousness to this particular charge being leveled against you, because I've spent most of my adult life kind of embedded in ethnic minority communities in North America, advocating for the human rights of ethnic and religious minorities abroad. I studied Chinese history, I studied Mandarin, I practice a form of Chinese Buddhism, so the idea of me as being some kind of like unrepentant white supremacist is just kind of insane. But that's the problem with these types of kind of social media character assassination things, is that it doesn't really matter what's true, and there's not a lot of room for sort of sober second thought when these types of stories come out. That's one of the really disappointing things to me about this. I have some friends and acquaintances who work in newsrooms in different parts of the country who told me when this story came out, they're sitting around the newsroom telling their colleagues, like, don't you guys see the red flags here? Isn't there something about this that just seems like below the belt, disingenuous? This is, someone leaking private conversations to destroy someone's career. And it doesn't make any sense if you've ever met me. But there is this tendency, especially in an election cycle, to just rush to judgment. It's an easy story to write. Reporters know how to write this narrative. Reporters, to their credit, they are under a lot of pressure. They have to turn out a lot of content. And it's hard to really look into this stuff. So I think I would hopefully think that it's sort of the type of story that causes people to think, well, maybe we should just be a little slower to judgment sometimes and be a little more inclined to interpret with good faith things that we don't understand. Because one of the things I think that you guys were talking about, and we talk about it on the show all the time as well, is that we do have a demographic problem
I went to a speech last week, Peter Zion. That's actually where I met a friend of your family's who told me that I should try to get in touch with you. But Peter Zion talks about this issue of how we don't have replacement population, that young people aren't having kids to the same extent, and there's only a couple of ways to deal with it. You either have to cut your social programs, or you've got to be more open to accepting immigration.
You practice what demographers call replacement migration, where you supplement a declining birth rate and an aging population with international migration. And certainly the problem is more acute in some other parts of the world, right? There are pockets of Europe where the natural replacement rate's like 2.1 children per woman. There are parts of Europe where it hovers close to 1. And that's, these are communities that I am not a demographer, so maybe I shouldn't speak, but it seems to me like these are communities that are in terminal decline. So whether you think this is a good thing or a bad thing, it's a thing. And I don't think that we benefit from having a public sphere in which people use like guilt by association logic to foreclose the possibility of having civil, reasonable dialogue on important matters of legitimate public concern. You have to have a space to discuss things reasonably, because if you don't, these are things that people do have anxiety about. And if you don't create legitimate avenues where they can be challenged, where they can sort of meet people who have a different perspective, then you send it underground. You send it into echo chambers where people can be radicalized. So I think trying to shut down discussions and scare people and tell them they're not even allowed to think about these questions, I think that's liable to produce more civil strife, not less. So I think it's important that you have an environment where people can have respect. And I can't stress this enough. You have to really be very respectful, and you have to be thinking about how what you say on these types of issues can impact people and how it can make them feel. And so for that reason, I think especially if you're talking about something in a public forum, you really need to take account of different perspectives.
Okay, we're going to try to find out why it is Kareem decided that he wanted to destroy your career, but we'll do that right after this. Stay with us. Caylan Ford is my guest, former United Conservative Party candidate in Calgary Mountain View. Just telling her perspective. Be right back on 770 CHQ. All right. I got someone saying this Kareem guy may have just been a leftist sleeper agent. Maybe someone in the NDP passed him a stuffed envelope, promised him a gig in a re-elected NDP government. I mean, this is what we're trying to figure out, is why would somebody who is a friend of yours, and this is what I've been so frustrated with, is all of the damage being caused to the UCP has been damage from within, from people who you think are allies and fellow travelers and friends. So how did your relationship fall apart? Like, why did he do this to you?
That's the big question. He's never really given an answer. I guess I'll give you sort of the timeline. So we meet in February 2017. Sometime around August of 2017, I decide, you know what, this guy's kind of like ethically unmoored in an unsettling way. And I decide that I should slowly try to distance myself from him.
Are you able to give some examples of other things that he's done in other political circumstances?
So like the first thing that I remember was this is back in Toronto, and I had no experience in politics. I was a total neophyte, and he's like, come young woman, I will take you under my wing and I'll show you how grassroots politics works. Come out to this local constituency association board meeting, which happened to be in the community where I worked. So I go there one night, and the local board needs a new president. The president has stepped down, and there's this beautiful young Muslim woman who's running to be the new president. And before the board meeting, Kareem uses an anonymous email address to send just a really vicious, disparaging email about her to all the other board members. And she didn't win the presidency. And I just remember her kind of walking by him, and just, it was clear that all she wanted was for him to get out of her life. And he kept putting himself into her life to try to harm her. And I remember calling him out for it. Like, I told him that there's no justification for what you did, and this is cruel and vindictive. And I think I rationalized continuing to be friends with him by thinking, well, at least I call him out. Maybe I can have some kind of salubrious effect on his character if I just try to steer him toward a better way to live and a better way to think about the world. That's how I flattered myself to think that I could have that kind of effect. And Ultimately, he was driven out of Ontario politics because it was found that he was operating an anonymous Twitter account that he was just using to defame Conservative candidates and to sort of foment rumors of corruption within the Ontario PC party. So he was basically told to leave town. You'll never have a career in politics here again. He knew that I planned to move back to Western Canada with my family, and he moved to Calgary a couple months before I moved back here. I actually helped him get settled in the city. Like, I got a sublet for him with an old friend of mine because he couldn't find a place to live. I lined up a job interview for him doing sort of paralegal work at a law firm. He pretended to be, he often misrepresented himself as a lawyer, but he's not a lawyer. And then kind of out of the blue, I learned that he had started a rumor about me that I had accused another Conservative candidate of sexual harassment. Now think about this for a second. If you're a woman
and you're in the middle of Me Too,
and you're in the height of the Me Too movement, right? And you're interested in pursuing a career in politics. All the power brokers are male. If rumors get out that you make unfounded accusations of sexual impropriety or sexual assault, you're toast. No one will meet with you, right? Like you're absolutely done. So I think he understood that, and he sort of started this rumor in a way that was calculated to just make me like a sort of persona non grata.
You met with the person, though.
I met with the person who heard that pretty quickly, and we sort of cleared it up and confronted Kareem about this. And he sort of said, and it was the one maybe like, it seemed actually really contrite and really sincere when he said it. He's like, look, I have an alcohol problem. I'm impulsive. I was jealous of you because Jason Kenney wanted you to run. And he's sort of like, I've spent years in the bowels of politics trying to ingratiate myself to people, and I've gotten nowhere. And you have one meeting with Jason Kenney, and he wants you to run for the UCP. And so basically he said a lot of this came down to feeling jealous, but also just a sort of a general impulsiveness. And he sort of promised, I'm going to straighten up and I'm not going to play these games anymore.
And then when you were 9 months pregnant, he wanted to meet with you. He sounded fairly aggressive about it and pretty inappropriate too.
Yeah. So the next time I saw him was maybe a month and a half later. There was a political campaign event downtown. I think it was at Craft Brewery. I was like heavily pregnant, and Kareem was there, and he just tries insisting that he and I should go clear the air and go for drinks, and repeatedly asked me to leave the venue, to go with him to get drinks somewhere else. And I just say repeatedly, I'm not interested. There's nothing fruitful that could come of that. I just don't want this. As I'm trying to leave the venue, he's standing outside, and he basically tries to stop me from leaving, right? And becomes kind of increasingly belligerent. These two guys are standing by, trying to intervene, offering to walk me to my car and stuff. Eventually Kareem makes sort of a lewd comment that I'm not going to repeat on air. And I just say, like, you've crossed the line. That's really inappropriate. And I left. He went home and bought the domain name caylanford.ca, which is my name. A couple months later, I got a tip that he was planning, by then I'd decided that I was going to run in Calgary Mountain View. It was one of the communities in Calgary. I lived there when I was in university, have a strong affinity with the area. And so Kareem decided that he wants to try to take over the local constituency association board in Mountain View. And I get a tip from someone close to him saying he's doing this to try to get leverage over you. And sure enough, he goes to the meeting. He sort of brings a bunch of acquaintances along. He walks around the room and adds his name to people's ballots. And in at least one case, he also voted for himself on people's ballots. And everyone was just too polite to say anything or to raise a fuss. So he becomes the president of the board. A couple months later, he, and at this point, I'm pretty unnerved. I started to sort of complain to the party that this was really inappropriate for a guy who's gone and bought my domain name, who's taking over my board to try to sort of exercise power over me somehow. I remember reaching out to someone that was volunteering on Kareem's campaign. For background, Kareem simultaneously is pretending to be a federal candidate in Calgary Centre.
When you say pretending, he hadn't actually gone through the process of becoming...
He never became a registered candidate. He spent 9 months fundraising. I was told he raised in excess of $40,000, and he was never a registered candidate. So anyway, but he had volunteers working for him, and one of them told, I reached out to one of them and said, like, I'm actually getting pretty nervous about this. Like, should I be afraid of the fact that he figured out my home address? Like, do I need to upgrade my security system? Do I need a German Shepherd? And within that week, there was an attempted break and enter at my home when my 2 children were present. I don't know if that was him. It's not really his MO, but like I certainly remember being very unnerved by it. That when the police came to file a report and they say, is there anyone in your life you're worried about? And I said, there's one person and one person only, and it's Kareem. But I don't know that it was him. But also, my yard is not one you accidentally stumble into, though. So, and then he convinces members of the board that I've committed fraud. And he writes a sort of breathless letter to Janice Harrington calling for an investigation into me, accusing me of defrauding the electorate.
And I had heard that there was this negative campaign against you. I thought it was one of the rival candidates, quite frankly.
No, it was him. So he was at one point allied himself with one of the other candidates. But
we're going to have to hear that part of the story when we get back. Stay with us. News is next on 770 CHQR.
Danielle Smith on 770 CHQR.
Brought to you by the Popowich Carmeli Advisory Group, CIBC Wood Gundy.
All right. Well, as you can imagine, we have, as always, some polarized comments. People saying that Caylan sounds like, oh, poor me, too bad, so sad. Another person saying, in the beginning, this lady sounded awesome. She had my vote 2 minutes in, educated, multilingual, and up on the issues. However, after listening more, she's far too gullible for public office and far too nice to what she described as a stalker. I hope she stays out of politics. Just my opinion. A couple of other people say, wow, we Albertans are missing out on the opportunity to have a fine individual represent us. What a shame. Another person saying, what a loss to our political arena in Alberta, eloquent, thoughtful, and clearly intelligent. I hope this is not the last we'll hear from you. That comes from a Mountain View resident named Joyce. Another person says, no offense to you, Danielle, but she comes across way too intelligent to want to be a politician. I wish her well in her future endeavors. And we've got this one, speaking from a person who retired from the police service in major crimes, your guest should be reporting this to the police. So let me deal with the first comment and the last comment. As people are saying, how could you not know with all the warning signs? How did you miss them? And why didn't you go to the police to report them?
So when I look back in retrospect, there were so many red flags. There was actually like a month in after I first met him, I had one conversation with him that I came away from, and I actually called a friend who's a psychiatrist and I said, let me describe this guy's behavior because I think he might be a psychopath. What's the diagnostic criteria for psychopathy? And she's like, Caylan, if you're asking that question, like you should just get away from this person. And for some reason I didn't. And I'm still kind of trying to psychoanalyze myself and figure out why.
What about reporting to the police?
So I did. So after the break and enter at my home, I filed a police report then, and I kind of mentioned his name as someone that they should have a report into, just for posterity in case. And then several months ago, when things continued to escalate, there's some folks on my campaign team who just urged me, you need to make sure all of this is on the record because it might be crossing into a threshold of criminal harassment. So I did in fact file police reports. Now, our criminal harassment laws are drafted in a way that it's not really designed for kind of a social media era or for the types of things that he's doing. It's more about someone's lurking outside of your house, right? But I have filed police reports, yeah, and also sent him a cease and desist for a campaign of defamation that he was running, which we didn't have a chance to get into. But yeah, I mean, basically, this story just continues to escalate.
And so, why did you feel like you couldn't defend yourself? Because here you are defending yourself. It's clear this person had some kind of personal vendetta against you. It still seems a bit unclear to me all the reasons for that. So why not just tough it out and try to repair your reputation, stay on as a UCP candidate?
Well, we talked about that a little bit at the top of the show, didn't we? I think partly it's just like shortly after this happened, I was pretty good about not taking media inquiries, but I did talk with one reporter, and he basically asks for comment on the story that you're a sympathetic to white supremacist terrorists or something. And so I said, of course, that's ludicrous and not at all what I believe. but there's another story here that you're missing. And, I told him at some length what had happened and also what I think is kind of the broader significance for our political culture and our media culture of the way that these things play out. And the guy at the end, he's just sort of like, well, I don't really know what to do with any of that. And so I don't think he used any of our interview, and he just sort of wrote the piece that he was planning to write. Media know how to write that narrative. And I don't think that because of the pressures they're under in an election campaign, I don't think they're well equipped to consider that there might be a lot more to these types of stories.
I have somebody saying, I know Karimi is a lawyer and offering a comment on that. Is he a lawyer?
No, he went to law school. He did his undergraduate law degree and then a master of law at the Sorbonne. He's never completed articles and never passed the bar in any jurisdiction.
Okay, it also says that he received a commission captain in the Canadian Armed Forces. Is he in the Armed Forces?
No. So last summer, he started telling people that he had received a commission, as you said, in the Canadian Armed Forces. He told me, actually, that he was commissioned as a captain in the Armed Forces. As far as I know, that's just a complete lie.
So what's your next step here? Because, you've got people saying this could potentially be a major crime. You've got others wondering about defamation and what you're going to do. What is your next step?
Well, look, I don't think that I'm the first person whose life has been kind of derailed by this guy. I hope I'm the last. But that's one side of it. And I think that hopefully this prompts other people to step forward with their own stories. I think if you walk into a room of conservatives in Calgary, you say this guy's name, people will line up to tell you stories. But that's kind of secondary to me. I think that in some ways this incident illustrates broader problems with the direction of our political culture. And they're things that I spent my whole campaign warning about, which is sort of the erosion of good faith, the tendency to treat people on the other side as not just people who have ideas we disagree with, but as bad people, right? To try to cast them and their views as being just beyond the pale, treating politics as total war, where you don't want to debate and engage with people who hold different views, you want to destroy them. And I think those are the tendencies that we're seeing here. And I think it's important that we try to find some space in our politics for grace, for forgiveness, for just a little bit more understanding. For a commitment to seeking truth, right? And that requires a level of intellectual discernment and of moral courage, and then a commitment to exercising decency. We've seen so many people, it's becoming a really common trend to see people just decimated by sort of social media mobs, by people who don't know them, who don't really care about them, but who want to drive them out of public life for some perceived thought crime. This is so corrosive to our democracy, to our public discourse. And one of the things that really, I've had friends in the NDP reach out to me and say that they're absolutely chilled by what happened to me, because it's set a precedent that says, look, if you're considering running for public office, your private correspondences will be mined for evidence of thought crimes. They will be torn out of context, twisted around. You'll have, terrible bad faith interpretations of your words, and it'll be held up to destroy you and your family and everything you've ever worked for. All of your professional accomplishments nullified. The fact that you're a loving spouse and mother doesn't matter. And you'll just be held up as an object of sort of opprobrium. Who will run for office? Better people? No. What does that do to our public discourse?
People who are prepared to do whatever it takes.
Exactly. The only people left would be totally unscrupulous people, right? People with absolutely no shame. And is that what we want to do?
People are asking, are you still supporting the UCP?
Yeah, absolutely. A big part of the reason why I decided to step aside is because I think this election is extremely important for Alberta. And I didn't want my own sort of fight to become a distraction. So, I'm fully behind the gentleman who stepped in my place. Jeremy Wong is a lovely guy. I ran against him in the nomination. He's just... The first time I met him, I actually remember thinking to myself, if I wasn't running against this guy, I would vote for him. He's wonderful. But
Caylan, he's a misogynist. We're being told that, right?
Oh my God. So the day, it was 12 hours after the UCP announced that he was my replacement, Press Progress had a hit piece on him. They had gone into, he's a pastor at an ethnic church up in North Calgary. They had gone to his church, recorded his sermons, I guess. I mean, maybe they pulled them off lives, like maybe they got them online, and they were trying to paint him as a misogynist, which is, to me, as someone who knows him, just transparently ridiculous. And I realized then maybe they're just doing this because Mountain View is a target seat. There's no incumbent. The NDP think they have a chance of winning there.
They have an important cabinet minister there,
They have
too,
an important
Kathleen
cabinet
Gavin.
minister running there. And so, I mean, what it says to me is just that there are no, look, if you're in a political party and there is nothing you won't do to win, you have lost something much more important than an election. There have to be some standards below which you won't descend. And this kind of politics of personal destruction, we have to find a way to put a stop to that.
I have somebody saying, no matter what you've said on this show today, that you're still going to be referred to as the candidate who made white supremacist comments.
Yeah, probably.
Do you think you can come back from all of the negativity? Do you want to be in public life?
So I think I've actually spent a large part of my life mentally preparing for a scenario like this. I mentioned to someone the other day, I've had this file on my computer. It's called When the Mob Comes for You, and it's like things that I wrote to myself, like if and when something like this would happen. So I think I always kind of knew, like, if you're a person in public life in our current climate, and if you're someone who's interested in ideas and who is interested in seeking truth, at some point, someone's going to try to do something like this to you. Most of my kind of intellectual heroes at some point have been subject to something like this. So I've kind of been mentally preparing for that possibility. And large part of my background, I've spent most of my life studying totalitarian systems, especially totalitarian communist systems, but not exclusively. And you'd always read accounts, like in the Cultural Revolution in China, of the public criticism sessions, right? The guy, like the Mao, would set a quota for how many people need to be purged and criticized, and so every town and village would have to find people in their population to purge. Sometimes that would mean killing them or sending them to prison, but sometimes you just sort of parade them out, you humiliate them in a ritual fashion, you make them write sort of self-criticisms, criticizing their own thoughts. And I remember reading these accounts, and it often struck me that the people that they were doing this to were usually the best people, right? It was the people who refused to be part of the mob themselves, and that's why they were targeted. And so I remember thinking, if you were born in a different time and place, if you were in that environment, if you were in Germany in the 1930s, in North Korea, like, which side of the mob would you be on? And I remember thinking to myself, well, I certainly wouldn't want to be on the side of the mob. So how do you inoculate yourself against those tendencies? And what I ultimately came to, and I actually, I talk about this in my stump speeches. This is what I would talk about. It's kind of weird. But I kind of came to two conclusions. You have to venerate truth. And that means, as I said, you have to be able to sort of to discern it, to seek it fearlessly, and you have the courage to give expression to it. And then you have to be committed to treating other people with compassion and decency, and remembering that they have inherent dignity that you should not transgress against. And that means if you ever have a choice between doing evil or having evil done to you, you always choose the latter. And so that's to say, I've spent a large part of my life kind of thinking about how would I respond in such a scenario. And yeah, it sucks. It sucks. I walked into the bank the other day. This is 10 days after all this happened. And I still see my face above the fold in the newspaper being held up as an example of, someone who doesn't deserve to be in public life.
You're very composed, though.
I'm trying to, I try to take a philosophical approach. Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it's really hard. The hardest and the best thing has been the letters that I received. And I should mention this because I received probably over 200 emails from voters in Mountain View. I haven't responded to all of them, but if you sent me one, know that I read it. I didn't get emotional in this whole process until I started reading those emails, because I think I mentally prepared myself for the possibility of feeling utterly alone. And then I was shocked to find that I wasn't. And just the messages from people who know me, who met me even really briefly, telling them that they still believe in me, that they know that the things that were being said about me aren't true. Yeah, that's what really got me. And I never took stock of the fact that I spent 9 months meeting thousands of people and connecting with them, even in some small way. And it's, sorry, I'm like really trying to hold it together here.
And I'm not saying anything because you're making me cry too.
But I thought door knocking was going to be so terrible. Like, your job description as a candidate is you go and knock on people's doors at dinner time and when they're putting their kids to bed, and then you try to like sell yourself. And I'm kind of an introvert, and I just thought this is the worst job description you could ever give to me. And it turned out that it was actually the best. Like, the demos really is the best part of democracy. It's the people. And so to the people in Mountain View that I met, I just want to say, like, the experience of getting to know people is something that I will cherish for the rest of my life.
Well, thank you for coming in and telling your story. And I'm not going to ask you if you're going to run again, but I hope we'll have another conversation again.
I think the answer is no.
That was Caylan Ford, former United Conservative Party candidate in Calgary Mountain View. And that is her side of the story. We'll be right back on 770 CH.